welcome back to another episode of Resolution, the official podcast of the Restorative Justice Council. I'm your host for today, Glenn Miller, and on this episode we're going to be finding out more about the role of the police and crime commissioners and how restorative services are quality assured, and also explore the issues around access in terms of restorative justice across the UK. I'm joined today by Jim Simon from the Restorative Justice Council, and I'm also joined by Steve Turner. He is the Police and Crime Commissioner for Cleveland. Steve, why don't we just kick off with you? Maybe just give us an introduction to what the Police and Crime Commissioner for Cleveland actually does.
Yeah, without a doubt. Thanks for having me. It's a really interesting question and one I get asked all the time, because the vast majority of people who live in Cleveland, and even many of those who vote in Police and Crime Commissioner elections, don't really understand what my job is. And there's two parts to it, really. And one is the police bit. So I am elected to be the public's voice within Cleveland Police. And it's up to me to, on their behalf, hold the Chief Constable to account for delivering an efficient and effective police service for the public of Cleveland. And that is a chunk of a job, and it's got its difficulties, and Cleveland Police has its challenges. So that in itself is a challenging part of the role. The other part of the role, the and crime commissioner part of the role, is probably what takes up the vast majority of my day to day. And that's about what do we do for victim services? What do we do with diversionary programs? How do I work with local authorities and local partners to try and reduce crime? And that's in a variety of different ways, whether that's looking at reoffending and people not reoffending, whether that's looking at diverting young people away from the paths they're on into crime, whether that's educating people around the dangers of knife crime, the dangers of drugs and things like that, or whether that's just ensuring that if somebody's been a victim of crime, that we're supporting them in a way that ensures that they can go on and ensure they have fulfilling lives after they've been that victim, and helping them rebuild in some places. So it is a vast and varied role that puts me into contact with just about every organisation you could imagine across the whole of the Cleveland area. And it's really fulfilling. I don't think there's a day go by where I don't go home and know that either me, my team, or one of the agencies we support has been able to help somebody in Cleveland.
From some of the things that you've just said there, it seems almost like a perfect segue into the whole idea of restorative justice. Some of the things you mentioned about preventative measures and, issues around supporting people, either reintegrating or how we support people who have been the victim of crimes and things as well. So I suppose my first question to you is, why do you think it's important to have a restorative justice service?
I think I talked about this before I was elected, because when you look at what restorative justice is, and we talk about restorative justice in isolation, but generally I think you've got to look at the bigger picture of that, from both the victim perspective and also from the perpetrator perspective, because if we can find ways for people not to reoffend, and whatever that might look like, and sometimes restorative justice has a big part to play in that for some people. If we cut that reoffending number down, we dramatically reduce crime in Cleveland as a whole. So Cleveland has a population of well over 500,000 people. And within that, 80% of the crime we see is committed by only 500 people. So if we start knocking those 500 people off from reoffending, we really do drive down crime statistics and crime instances. And we have less crime, we have less victims. We have less victims, we have a much better community. And so that type of thing is what I looked at. Restorative justice, I admit to not really knowing a great deal about when I first started campaigning, but got more into it and a better understanding of it when you start to see that it's far from a soft option, which is what some people think it is. And you start to understand that not only is it massively helpful to the victims, to some victims, not to all, not only is it massively helpful to the victims, but it also has a part to play in ensuring that those offenders don't reoffend and they go on to be lead fulfilling lives within society.
So you mentioned there that when you came into the role, you weren't completely aware of what restorative justice was. How did you actually end up getting a knowledge of how it worked? You know, who did you end up speaking to that helped you get a grasp of it? And how did that then help you connect dots between what it was trying to do and what your job is?
I think what my job does is it throws me in front of a whole range of interesting and knowledgeable people. And when you couple that with the fact that I'm a great believer in, if you don't know about something, go away and Google it and find out information and read research and things like that. So through Safer Communities, through Restorative Cleveland, through our partners really, and the people we work with, on whether that's through our Divert scheme or through local authorities even. And you get into that world and then talking to members of the probation service and then meeting people who have taken part in the programs. And then when you pull all of that together, and you do really need to pull all of that together, it is not a topic you can just dip into at the top and think you know a great deal about it. We are learning, I am learning constantly, but you really have to get into the service. And until you've spoken to a victim who's been through that and tells you what it did for them, until you've spoken to a perpetrator and been through that and you understand what it means for them, you can't begin to understand how that whole thing fits into this jigsaw that we call the justice system.
It sounded like it's impacted you a wee bit personally as well. Am I picking that up right?
I think the whole rehabilitation thing is a personal thing for me, at whatever level. So from a personal perspective, I know growing up in the community I grew up in, there were some good people that made bad decisions, right? I'd be very surprised to find anybody who says they've never made a bad decision. And sometimes people make bad decisions and get away with it and learn from that bad decision and think they're but for the grace of God. And sometimes people make bad decisions and end up being punished for it. And where they are, it doesn't make them bad people. The difficulty we have in this country is once you have been punished for something, or once somebody decides that you are a particular type of person, you are stigmatized. And then the media has a massive part to play on that. And the hypocrisy that I see on a personal level from people that portray an image of being tolerant and thoughtful and want people to lead lives and everybody deserves a second chance type thing, to then see, well, actually, you're not putting in that practice and you're in a position where you could do more. That might be an employer that could support somebody that's coming out of prison. That might be a politician who wields influence over the media or things like that. That might be somebody in my position. I'm in a fortunate position where I have the knowledge now and the capability of being able to support people on that journey. If I didn't do that, that would make me as hypocritical of some of the other people that talk a good job and don't actually do anything about it.
Sure. So you found out more about restorative justice. You recognised in terms of the role that you're doing it has a part to play, especially a quality service has a real part to play in that. So I suppose one of my questions would be in regards to that, how do you then determine the amount of resource that you allocate to restorative justice provisions?
That becomes a challenge because it's like everything else. We have a finite amount of resources. It is a useful tool within our armoury. It's a key tool within our armoury. But I could say that about pretty much every service my office comes into contact with. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that when we're funding services, we are getting the best bang for our buck. We are getting the most value for money. I know I regularly see, not so much on restorative justice, but on other things, I'll see grant bids coming through and I see big multinational organisations asking for tens of thousands of pounds, but delivering a programme for me that is maybe a tenth of the impact that somebody down the road who runs a local community charity can deliver for me for a fraction of the cost and touch hundreds of more people. Mm-hmm. So I've got to be mindful of that value for money piece because it's not my money, it's public money. Every penny we spend through the Office of the Police and Crime Commissioner in one way, shape or form has come from the public purse. So we look to do that and get the best possible value for money. But then we've also got to monitor that as well, because again, sometimes you might have an organisation that has the best intentions and is doing the right things, but if they're not delivering measurable results, then there's tough decisions to be made on that as well. And I've had to do some of that since I came into this role, where you see good projects that are making an impact and making a difference to people's lives, but if they're not great value for money, and you need to divert those resources to somewhere else where you might get a better set of results, then you've got to do that, and that upsets some people. But that's why somebody has to do the job I do.
Sure. And so, how has restorative justice here provided or showed you that it is value for investment?
The most impactful thing I think I have honestly seen within, and it's coming up 2 years this May, 2 years in this role. The most impactful thing I think I've come across is the time I sat down with a victim of male rape, and he talked me through his story, and what he'd been through and how it had impacted him personally, and then what the restorative justice process had delivered for him, and what that meant to him, and how that come out. And he was not just articulate and open about what he went through, but he spoke with a depth of knowledge and passion that I rarely see in other things. So that particular morning when he came into my office and told me his story was phenomenally impactful. And I know he's just one of dozens that restorative justice works with here in Cleveland. And that story alone was worth the money my office invested. But I know that story isn't one in isolation. I know that could be replicated dozens and dozens of times if I asked them to see that. And my office does monitor that. My office does check that.
So one of the things that I'm aware of is that different areas have got like different criteria in terms of what makes cases suitable or not suitable for RJ referrals. And some people refer to this as like a postcode lottery, meaning that some participants are unable to access restorative services. Why do we not have nationally standardised criteria for referrals?
It's a good question. And I think whenever you get nationally standardised criteria for anything, you will still get winners and losers. So the best example I could give of that is of serious violence here, from a personal perspective, serious violence here in Cleveland. So the government had a nationalised standard set of criteria for which 18 police forces were going to receive funding for a serious violence unit. That nationally standardised set of criteria meant that Cleveland was number 19 on that list, so didn't receive anything. But if you'd have cut those figures a different way, Cleveland would have been number 3. So we would have had that money 3 years sooner than we did. And that was based on a nationalised standard criteria. Restorative justice RC is the same thing. We could standardise the criteria, but what is a problem here in Cleveland and what is a major issue here in Cleveland might not even sit on anybody's radar in Surrey, right, for that fact. And problems you see in inner cities like Birmingham, like Manchester, like Liverpool, like London, thankfully don't appear on the radar of even forces like ourselves sometimes. So if you standardise something across the country, what you tend to find is you standardise to the bigger population areas. Okay. And therefore, smaller population areas like ours, there will be great examples of where we could add value and we could add impact, but wouldn't meet those standardised criteria. And conversely, some of the things we want to touch on, areas like Surrey, even parts of North Yorkshire, for example, might not even consider it to have touched their radar. So I think if you did standardise it, we'd still be having this debate. We'd just be having it from a different angle.
Okay. You mentioned a wee bit there about monitoring the projects that you invest in. How do you ensure that the services you're commissioning are providing high quality, safe and effective restorative justice?
I have a brilliant team, to be fair. I'm not going to say it's anything to do with me. And what they do on every organisation we work with, every grant fund we give out for whatever reason, at whatever level, They do their due diligence. So they check out the individuals concerned within those organisations. They check out those organisations as a whole. There is a very stringent bid process that is adhered to and we don't stray from, to be fair. And then the monitoring afterwards, there are regular meetings held around the figures. And not just what does the top line figure say, but what does that mean? So you might say we've had 30 interventions last month on X project, for example. But does 30 intervention means you've talked to 30 people, or does 30 interventions mean that you've talked to 60 people, you've then actually done some work with 30 of them, and you've really, really helped 15 of them? So we get under the skin of that as well, so we understand what those figures mean. But I'll be lying if I said that was anything to do with me. That is all down on my team.
No, I appreciate it. It almost reflects the whole idea of the restorative approach, that it's a collaborative approach, and without a lot of people contributing to it, its effectiveness would be lessened as a result of that. Yep. So it's good to hear that you've got good people behind you helping you out with that as well. Jim, just want to bring you in here in regards to one of the episodes that we started to briefly mention, the All Parliamentary Group for RJ. What is that?
So the All-Party Parliamentary Group was set up back in early 2021, and it's a group of cross-bench MPs and peers from the House of Lords with an interest in restorative justice and an interest in how it can be better represented across a range of policy positions for the government. So criminal justice features very highly on that, and the Ministry of Justice has for a long time held responsibility for restorative justice. But actually, the more work that they have done, they've started to see the benefits of this in other areas. So we're now looking at what's the impact of working restoratively in schools, and what link could that have to potential future engagement with criminal justice services if you're using it as a preventative tool. But also things like healthcare, and the benefits of working restoratively when harm's caused within health, same with social care. One of the big pieces of work that they did from the outset was to look at the current state of restorative justice across the country, and it focused on the government's last action plan, which expired back in 2017 and was never renewed. And what they wanted to do was to look at how far have we come since then, and a lot of the points that Steve raised, unfortunately, still come up in that report, and have been questions that we've had for a long time. So the postcode lottery of services, the whether or not referrals should be standardised, were all elements within that report for future work. So we're now taking some of those and are looking at what needs to change, what are the implications of doing that, and who do we need to be speaking to make the changes.
Yeah. So I suppose that links in with the APPG report in 2022, mentions about gatekeepers, about who has about having control over who can and cannot access those controls. What impact are you seeing that having on the restorative justice sector?
So from a service provider point of view, it has a huge impact, and I think one of the challenges with the services that we speak to is that you will have police and crime commissioners like Steve who are very focused on having a service and making that as accessible as possible. But then we have these pockets of gatekeepers who decide whether or not someone should even be informed about a restorative process, and typically it's the perpetrator who ends up being at the negative side of that. So we don't feel this person should be told that the victim wants to meet them because we don't think it's safe. And of course, we need to take all of their advice, and risk assessments and everything else together. But the challenge that providers have had is that information, that desire to meet, isn't being communicated to the offender, and the victim isn't told why that can't go ahead. There's no reason given. The provider is just told, no, you can't do it. And it's then down to them to go back to that victim and explain, or try and explain, the reason why. And And actually, one of the things that we've talked about throughout the podcast has been around, primarily anyone working restoratively doesn't want to cause more harm. Decisions made by gatekeepers cause more harm. And the way to repair that is to say, we can't do it because of X, Y, and Z. So that there's a clear message to go back.
Yeah.
And it ultimately, it can impact in that Steve isn't getting the service that he wants because other people are preventing referrals being progressed. Mm-hmm. So there's a whole issue there that needs a lot of conversations as to how you work that out. But ultimately, working with these gatekeepers, and normally it's a lack of understanding and the assumption that, you're going to put these two people together in a room, which isn't necessarily the end result that either of them want. Some form of communication would be better than none.
Yeah.
But knowing why you can't do something is important.
Yeah, I suppose there's like a triangular need thing, or so it's between the how, the what, and the emotion all being blended. Because if you leave one of those out, then the process can fall apart at that, So great, Jim. Thanks very much. Steve, going to come back to you. What do you think is the biggest challenge facing restorative justice?
I think communication is without a shadow of a doubt. I would have been, I suppose, if I'm honest, I would have been in the camp that my gut feeling about restorative justice, before I knew anything about it, was they're just saying what they need to say to get a lighter sentence or a soft option or something along those lines. And the times in my life where I have been a victim of crime, I've never once thought of a situation where I think speaking to the person who did that would have helped me. Mm-hmm. Right? So that's a personal view. That's a personal view. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. It's a perfectly legitimate view to hold. When you then start to look at it, and it's not so much for, you don't need to, it's not one of these, I'm not going to go on a crusade to educate everybody about the benefits of restorative justice. I think the people we do need to educate better on the benefits of restorative justice are those gatekeepers that Jim talked about. For an example, I know I talked about the gentleman that was a victim of male rape and the impact his story had on me. There are colleagues of mine who are absolutely vehemently against rape victims having that, or rape perpetrators having that option for restorative justice. Yet I saw the benefit to the victim for that. Mm-hmm. I think we need to help educate victims of that this is an option for them and what it might mean. Now, that's not just to say, restorative justice is an option, because if you offer a victim a restorative justice option and they don't understand what that means, they're going to say no because they think it's a soft option. We need to be able to help them or give them the materials, if they choose to look at them, that says this is how it's helped other people, this is how it might help you. So there's a lot of work to be done there. And then we also, the third pillar of that is educating the perpetrators themselves to say, right, well, actually, this is really, and the perpetrators I've read the stories of and the perpetrators I've spoken to will tell you it is one of the hardest things they've had to do. And if something makes a perpetrator of a crime genuinely think about their actions, if it genuinely makes them consider their actions at the next point in time where they may be about to commit a crime, then that's a good thing. And we won't get it all right. And some people who go through restorative justice will reoffend, and we can't see that as a failure. And we've got to stop seeing that as a failure, because they might have committed a burglary and they might commit another burglary, but what's to say their next burglary might not have been an aggravated burglary or a burglary with menace or something like that, and they stop short of that because of the process they've been through. And those are the types of things we can never really truly measure. But those three things, so we need to educate the gatekeepers, educate victims, and educate perpetrators. And when I say educate, it is more guide than educate. If they want to be educated, they'll ask for it. If you've just got to say there is an option for them there.
Yeah, and I think there's maybe an option there for, people who have caused harm to be part of that education process. I'm thinking of the likes of Rob, who we've had on the podcast, speaking very, succinctly about the experience he had, and he spoke quite openly about what you were saying there, Steve, about the fact that he went through a restorative process makes him stop and think about some of the things that he may or may not decide to do, you know, and it almost in essence it's like the voice of Jama appears in the back of his head, you know, and he hears, and it's like sometimes that's a deterrent for him, you know. So I think there's a real role for, like you said, people who have been involved in the process to actually be part of that education process, which is great. Maybe that's something that services really need to look into as well, you know. But we need to be careful about that, because you don't want to be wheeling people out as trophies, you know, and going, listen, look at what happened to these people as a result of that, you know, because it's not indicative of the process as a whole.
Yeah, I think for me, every single human on the planet makes decisions based on emotion, right? And your emotion at the time drives your decision. Your decisions drive your actions, and so be it. I think if at that decision-making point, something within your subconscious reminds you of the emotion you felt last time you made that decision, that's how we choose to make our decisions. Children don't touch fire because it's hot, because when they do touch fire, they get burnt and they don't like the feeling. That's what's embedded in their subconscious. And sometimes I think things like restorative justice can embed in somebody's subconscious those emotions that led to the decisions they made previously and will lead them to make different decisions.
Steve, thanks very much for coming in and joining us on the podcast. I think it's been great to hear that perspective, you know, from somebody who has a responsibility towards how policing is, you know, governed, and also how we are responding to the issues of crime within our communities. You know, it's refreshing, I think, to hear, you know, someone speak, you know, so passionately about the restorative process and believe in it, you know, from almost being outside the sector and stuff, you know. I think that's great. And I think that's also maybe a testament then to the relationships that have been built up between the police and the restorative justice service here in Cleveland. And that's such a vital part of restorative processes being successful anywhere, is the relationships that they have with potential partner agencies and stuff. But really appreciate you coming in and sharing those thoughts with us, man. So thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Not a problem. So, folks, that's the end of this episode. Make sure you check out our other episodes. They'll be available on Apple and Spotify. And thanks for listening.